So this gentleman over here leaning against the wall is Brian Capouch, and he will be doing our program tonight. I can tell you that he has done lots of research. He's talked to lots of people. I think he's found some family connections here, there, and everywhere. So we're going to enjoy his talk, I think, as much as he enjoyed getting ready for it. Brian?
Okay, so we're going to talk tonight about Orchard Lake Stock Farm. And I was very daunted when we decided that this is what I was going to talk about, because I compare this to carrying coals to Newcastle when I come to Newton County to talk about Orchard Lake, because Orchard Lake is Newton County, and I would assume that anybody at the Historical Society here already knows pretty much everything there is to know about Orchard Lake. I'm hoping, however, that I can bring some new information before you tonight. And so to start with, this is easy to remember, sunnycrestfarm.org/Orchard Lake. All these slides have links in them, and when you click on those links, later on, I'm going to talk about a couple of scandals that you probably don't know about that affected Warren McRae. And rather than go into the lengthy explanations of those scandals, my intent is that there's a link right there. You can come back later, and you probably are going to want to look at some of the pictures more closely, because I've got 75 slides to do here in this hour, meaning it's going to be 20 minutes, okay? Now, if you wanted to call me out on that, I could do it in 20 minutes because I can talk pretty fast. But anyway, that's my email address. My name is Brian Capouch, and then that is the link for this presentation. If you have a phone and you have trouble seeing, on your phone, if you go to that site, the slides will show up on your phone at the same time that I show them up here in front of everybody. And so, I want to tell you a little bit about what I'm going to do tonight. Much of what I'm going to talk about is the farm itself. I spent most of the last month reading, going to the recorder's office. I made 3 trips to the recorder's office, and I have looked at more property records than I actually thought I was going to have to on this, and you're going to hear in a little bit that's kind of complicated too. Then I want to talk a little bit about Hereford cattle in Indiana. You may or may not be aware, but the northern part of Indiana was a central place in the history of the Hereford industry in the United States, and some of the most progressive and sort of like earth-changing changes in the Hereford cattle market happened right here in northern Indiana. Then we're going to take a look at some of the people who owned Orchard Lake through the years. Some of them were interesting, some of them were more interesting than others. 4 in particular, however, are of great interest to us, and so we're going to take a little vignette of each of them, and there too I have some links that you can take a look at to look at some of these things more thoroughly. Then we're going to take a look at the farm today. I made a pilgrimage over there last Tuesday, got to spend a wonderful afternoon on the farm. Its owner, Henry Cousins, who is here this evening, gave me a tour of the farm and let me take some pictures of some of the things that you're going to see in the older pictures and see what they look like today. So first we're going to look at the farm, and most of what I'm going to talk about today is based on this. And I have to tell you that the farm is more of a concept than a real thing. And when I say that, what I mean is that the acreage and the parcels varied widely over the years. Although in the recorder's office, in their index book for the winter of 1939, whoever it was that recorded the transaction marked it Orchard Lake Stock Farm and then listed all of the properties that constituted Orchard Lake Stock Farm. Interestingly, Henry Cousins bought it. He is the most recent owner. He bought it in 1986, and only one tiny little piece that he bought was the same as the pieces that were sold in 1939. That is, I found dozens and dozens. Actually, I think it was about 130 total transactions that were done on the various pieces of land that could be considered part of Orchard Lake. So when you ask, where was Orchard Lake Stock Farm, it was lots of places. And even when McRae owned it, he had a north farm, an east farm, a west farm, and so on. And I have tried to reconstitute that. It has been a daunting challenge. So here's a little contest. The only part that Henry bought that was part of what the McRae family sold is that piece right there, and I'm going to read that to you. And the first person who can tell me how many acres that is, Beth has a prize for you. It's the southwest quarter and the west half of the northwest quarter of section 6, Township 28 North, Range 7 West. How many acres?
240.
Say it again. You got it. So you just won a dollar bill, a bright, shiny new dollar bill. 240 acres. Okay? That was excellent. But note that that's 240 acres out of 1,801 acres that McRae sold. And by the time Henry bought it, it was, I think, over 2,000 acres. But of all those various acreages, only that little piece was the same as what was sold back in 1939. So his homestead is located where the actual buildings were. And so that's going to be kind of the focus here. Rather than try to chase around which 40 and which 80 and which section of land was which, we're going to focus on that homestead piece. And so it is the only parcel that's in that. So my big surprise, first thing I do ever when I try to follow through on a piece of farmland is I go to the Web Soil Survey. Anybody here know what the Web Soil Survey is? Well, it's a place I'm about to show you. Actually, let me go through this part because this is going to tell you about my surprise. So Newton County basically consists of two different major types of soil. Those of you who've been around Newton County most of your lives know this. There are the sandy soils and there are the prairie soils. Because Kentland is part of the prairie and because Orchard Lake is so close to Kentland, my assumption was that it had to have been a prairie, but it's not. So my surprise was, and I have a word here I wanted to put before everybody because I think this is an amazing word. Who all in the house knows what loess is? Because loess is where the soil of Newton County's prairie came from. Okay? Anybody know where loess soil came from? Because to me, this is the most amazing thing. When I learned this, I literally fell off my chair. Loess is super good soil, silt, if you know your soil stuff, that was blown in here, just exactly like the sand hills were blown around after the glaciers left. Also after the glaciers left, they had glaciated part of the western part of the United States. They blew all this beautiful, fertile, black topsoil, and it was deposited right here on the Great Prairie. So there is a tiny bit of the farm that Henry bought that actually is part of this loess, the prairie soils. Most of it, however, is in fact sandy glacial outwash soil. And in fact, I was there last Tuesday. Anybody here remember anything unique about last Tuesday? Yep. And so I got back from Henry's farm. We went up to the hill where they used to raise the cattle on the hill and where the monument is, which we're going to see in a little bit. And I had sand in my little corners of my eyes when I got home. I had to clean out. Whoops, I just did that the wrong direction. Sorry. So I assumed that it was prairie and I was wrong. That said, as far as sandy soils go, it's about the best sandy soil you're going to find around. Very little of, as you'll see here in a little bit. The Web Soil Survey, that's a link. So if you go to this presentation, you can click there and you'll see this screen right here. And right here, in this place for address, when I put Henry's address, it brought up this map right here. And so off to the left, so the map right there, you can blow that up and you can see where each type of soil is. Each one has a little identifying pair of letters with it. And then the blue stuff on the right, those are all links. And if you click, for instance, on Brem's loamy sand, it will tell you where does this soil come from? How productive is it? Is it prime farmland? Is it suitable for building? Is it suitable for putting farm buildings and so on? So I tell everybody, if you have farmland, you really need to go here and check that out. Phone just went to sleep. So who all knows who's Fred Friedlein? All right, I talked about him last time. The story of Friedlein says that he was the builder of many of the structures at Orchard Lake. I have that only on a family history of his family. I don't have anything else. But he did design Sunnycrest, which is the farm just north of Robb where I live. And I found that Orchard Lake and Sunnycrest share a sort of unique feature that I'm going to be heading into here as I go forward. We also know for sure that he did build some of it. Fred Friedlein's grandson, John Friedlein, a couple of years ago, I hunted him up on the internet. He lives in North Carolina. He's a little older than I am. He is a grandson of Fred Friedlein, and he gave me this whole story. He said, I have a box of stuff that I got from my father's sister, and she was the family genealogist, but I can't find it. And so he sent me a few things that he had that he said he knew that I'd be interested in, one of which is this picture. So this is the bull barn at Orchard Lake, which was one of the more interesting structures there, and he built that. We can sort of kind of date it, assuming that that little kid sitting on the fence there is one of his two sons. His sons were born in 1910 and 1911. This particular, well, why both sons aren't there, his grandson couldn't tell me. But so assuming that that kid is about 5 years old, this would have been done about 1916, 1917, something like that. And that squares with most of the rest of the record. This also shows one of the more interesting features of Orchard Lake was the fact that they combined silos and water towers. So this is a water tower up at the top, and at the bottom of that was a silo. This was the bull barn. And take good note of it, because we're going to see it again several times in the subsequent pictures we're going to look at here. This is a map of Orchard Lake that was done. It was reproduced in a magazine. Beth, I think, has an original copy of this magazine. Henry has a copy of the magazine. Now I have a copy that I downloaded and printed online. I blew it up so that we could see it in a little better detail. This is the north segment. There's a machine shed, manure pit, an elevator, the cattle barn, and then a barn. The WT is a water tower. By the way, I have blueprints for my house, and the handwriting on my blueprints is identical to this. So I think that Fred Friedlein is the one who did this map. So this is the middle section, which is where most of stuff was. Orchard Lake there on the right, pump house, wash house, office, so on and so forth. The sales pavilion was attached to the cattle barn, and you can see where the bull barn set. That was the picture we saw just a little bit ago. It's set toward the front because this is the middle piece. Here's the southmost piece. All right, so off to the right. By the way, I have a laser pointer, and it was a little bit weak this morning, and I took the batteries out and put them in the charger. When I put them back in, now it won't work at all. So Murphy's Law. Anyway, Henry actually lived in that boarding house. That was all that was left of the domicile on the farm when he got it in 1986. The big house, which you see there, superintendent's house, burned in the 1940s. We're going to see several pictures of that house. It was a very elaborate house, and my understanding is that McCrae actually lived there before he moved to town, although there are some timing issues there relative to what I've read about his building the house in town. And since I'm in front of an historical society from Newton County, can I ask, what do people say? When did he build that house in town? Because here's what the problem is. Everything I've read was that he built the house in town in the 1890s. Well, he didn't build most of these buildings until after 1900. And so there's an issue there because he lived on the farm before he moved to town. So here is a postcard image that I got of Orchard Lake, and it features some but not all the buildings we just saw on that map. If you let me go back here, one thing that isn't there is the horse barn. If you look right there, there's an implement house and the boarding house. Right there on the right-hand side is the implement house. Dead ahead of us there in the center is the pavilion. Off to the right, or to the left there, is the bull barn, and you can see the tower next to it. So you see where it's set relative to the rest of the farmstead. This is the oil house at Sunnycrest, and when I bought the place and was getting my tour from Mr. Porteous, he said, this is probably the strangest building you're going to see here. Now, why would they have a separate house? And if we look back here, right here, the gas and kerosene house, which to me is further evidence that this was done by Fred Friedlein, because I think it was a Fred Friedlein thing to put these houses on these homesteads. Why would you do that? Well, if you read the newspapers from the old days, and in fact, those of you who may be from Kentland probably know this better than I do, Kentland had a very unique problem when it was growing up. It kept burning down, okay? And there were huge fires. And in fact, the first McCrae Bank was burned in the first of the, maybe it wasn't the first, because when you go back through the old newspapers, there were actually 5 or 6 fires, one of which took out most of downtown Kentland. The same thing used to happen on farms. And all of a sudden, and in fact, if you go through the old newspapers, there's plenty of evidence. The barn burned down. I lost all my horses, okay, which means now I can't till the ground anymore. I lost my feed, which I now have to grow again, so on and so forth. So Friedlein's big idea was separate the things that can burn from the rest of the place. And in the case of this house here at Sunnycrest, it's a really unique, it's different than the one I see. So the one on Orchard Lake looks like just a little farm, little tiny farm structure there. This thing is made out of brick. It is entirely lined with concrete, and it is down, that is, there's steps when you get to this door that go down about 4 feet. Why would you do that? To keep it cool, exactly, because a lot of the problems that they had were from spontaneous combustion. You'd have your oil and rags and things and all the grease, and it would warm up in the summertime, and once it got to the certain temperature, all of a sudden it catches fire. So it would be much harder to do there than it would be in a structure that's set closer to the ground. So now we're going to look at pretty pictures. I'm going to comment on some of these. This is, again, where if you have a link to this presentation, you can blow them up on your phone or your screen and look at them much more closely than you can in this. So this is my $10 purchase from an aerial photograph outfit, and when I'm looking at the picture on my screen, I could see all the buildings. So I clicked the little button, gave them my $10, and this is what I got.
That's it.
And I wasn't about to click a second time. Unfortunately, I'd had my fill of it with the first one, and so I didn't go again. But Henry pulled the trigger on this image. So he kindly let me take a picture of this. This is an aerial view that was taken in 1966. And again there, if I had my pointer, here is our pavilion. There is the cow barn, the cattle barn. Here is the house that was there until the 1980s. This was a machine shed. The oil house is gone. The garage is still there. There's a granary there. And I think this is, in fact, the tower that was left from the bull barn. Whoop, phone went to sleep. Sorry. Here we go. So this is a picture I got from Beth, which I find to be really interesting. It was in a series, and so I don't really know where it came from, just that it was one of them as you gave me. But if you look at this and look at the picture that follows, which is going to come from the newcomer, in 2002 they did a special piece about McRae and Orchard Lake. And the next picture coming, look at this closely, because when we switch to the next picture, most of the buildings are the same, but they don't look the same. So look at this. Most interesting, there is the house. Any of you have seen pictures of the homestead? So that they had built that house. Interestingly, they painted all the buildings white. They were red in the earlier picture, I assume red. But in that interim, this house is now gone that was there first. This is called an I house. This is a much more elaborate house. You can also see that they put up, they put up some kind of a thing, but you'll also see that in these later pictures that this structure kind of right in the center was repurposed as a garage and is called a garage on the map. So this is my favorite image. This is a postcard image that was taken. Let's go back. I think I put the picture in there twice so we could go back and forth and look. Yep, so there's the earlier picture. Here's the later picture. What's the difference between them? Well, some of the paint is different, but it's also true that the horse barn doesn't show up. That's a horse barn right there to the left, and you can see the pavilion, the cattle barn there, and this is the building that's in that old picture. It has been repurposed from some sort of a storage building to be a garage, or at least that's what it's marked on the map. This is ahead of a sale that was done. All the cattle lined up there, all the people checking out the cattle, and I thought this was a series of postcards that I found on eBay. It was one of those things where I was the only one that seemed to see it and realized they didn't know it was McRae's farm. They didn't know anything about it, just some pictures from Kentland, Indiana. And so I bought all these next series of pictures all in one purchase. Now this I thought was interesting for a different reason. You know, Orchard Lake was a Hereford farm. Cattle people, that ain't no Herefords. What's going on? Well, if you read the story, you find out that at first McRae did dairy cows and meat cows both. But he speaks in one of the articles to the fact, and this is a very Warren T. McRae thing to say, there was no money in the dairy cows. So after a couple of years of selling dairy cows, he got out of the business, but he also sold horses. He sold pigs, he sold sheep, he sold cattle. The man was a monster when it came to raising purebred animals and selling them. So this was the walk of the horses ahead of an auction that was held. You can see that they put up a tent. Word has it that even though the pavilion would hold 1,800 people, he would often have 5,000 show up. And so they had to do things outside as well as inside. This is a bunch of people checking out. It would be the equivalent of looking at before you go to an auction where the people can come and poke the tires and look at everything before the auction starts. This is all the buyers coming out there. I also want you to note this is about 1915. In the olden days, a man wouldn't be seen alive without a hat on. And if you look there, I believe I looked through this trying to find a single person there that wasn't wearing a hat. Every single person in the picture is wearing a hat, which I thought was kind of interesting. So this is interesting for a different reason. This was a couple of other postcards. I just bought one of these last week. I bought one the week before that. This says, looking toward the horse barn. So this building apparently was there before. This may have been one of the buildings that was in those older pictures, and I don't have time to go back through and compare, but the other structures in the other picture had 3 vents in the top and did not have a silo with it. This has a silo and only has 2 vents. But we also know that in those other 2 pictures, this building wasn't there anymore. Even more interesting, in this next image, this says I'm looking toward the sale barn, but that's not the pavilion. And it looks as if it's in some sort of a set of being torn down or something. And I have not seen another single image that has the silo in the center of the building like this. So what this is kind of a mystery. Some of this stuff I just came on to in the last day or two, and so I still have some investigating to do because I like to put together those kind of puzzles. Anyway, this is what the inside of the pavilion looked like at one of their sales. You'll also note that one of the little sort of things that distinguished the McRae sales from the others was the incredible degree of care that those animals got. They are in perfect alignment with one another, and they stood still, I have to assume, for the whole sale. So somebody spent a lot of time working with those cattle, a lot of time. So this is the bank, and this was this, called a discount deposit bank. It went bankrupt at the same time that Warren McRae did, and I have not been able to figure out where it sat in town, and I'm hoping that this audience might have somebody who knows. It was a stone building. I happen to know this. There was an announcement made that it was opened in the fall of 1912, interestingly, which was the exact same time that the Kent Bank opened, which was run by Carroll Kent. The Carroll Kent Bank is still there, as you probably know, right on the corner downtown, but I don't know where this was, but it was a stone building, and it seems odd that it would be gone, but it does seem to be gone now. So let's take a quick look at the Hereford industry. It is hard to overstate the importance of the Hereford industry and of this area to the Hereford industry in general. So the National Hereford Association was begun by a man named William S. Van Atta, who's going to come up later in the next slide. Anybody know what distinguished him? He was Moses Fowler's herdsman. Moses Fowler died in 1889. Van Atta didn't die until 1911. In between there, he became known as the ultimate breeder of Hereford cattle in the United States. He took over that role from another person in this area. Anyone want to name the man who is considered to be the father of Hereford cattle in the Midwest? It was Adams Earl Park's namesake. Okay, we're going to see more about him here in just a little bit. So the Herefords in our area, Tippecanoe County had Shadeland Farms. It was originally done by the Hawkins family. The Hawkins family was kind of, I think I mentioned this last time, you talk about a family that had an important role in northern Indiana history. The Hawkins daughter Eliza married Moses Fowler. The Hawkins daughter Martha married Adams Earl. And the Hawkins son Charles married Edward Sumner's daughter. So the Hawkins had a farm that they called Shadeland. And the town of Shadeland now is the closest populated place to where Shadeland Farms was. But Shadeland was mostly a grain farm until Adams Earl married Martha Hawkins, and at that point he imported some cattle from England, and Shadeland Farms actually became known as the ultimate source of high blood Hereford breeding in the United States. But he wasn't by far the only one, and in fact, even earlier, a man named Thomas Atkinson raised Hereford cattle right here in Newton County. All right, or actually it was in Benton County more than Newton County. Where is the town of Atkinson? It's where Benton Central School sits now, and so it was named for Thomas Atkinson. There is actually on the Indiana Historical Society website, they have a piece there about Atkinson, about his role in raising Herefords, and there's some argument about whether it was in 1824 or 1829. Either way, it was a long time ago. So also we had Moses Fowler, Adams Earl, Adams Robb, Edward Sumner, the Boswells, and then Van Natta, who was the herdsman earlier. In Iroquois County, we had Lemuel Milk, and you probably know that Mr. Milk also had property in Newton County. And what is Lemuel Milk most famous for? He drained Beaver Lake. Exactly right. He was the one in charge of that. And you probably all know, since he's an important part of Newton County history, that he had a daughter whose name was Conrad, who hated his guts. And so she took over the farm after he passed away, and so she stayed and, in fact, founded a town called Conrad in Newton County, which many of you probably know about. That wasn't it, though. We got one more here, and that was McRae and Conrad in Newton County. So in the old Beaver Lake area was a Hereford raising area for many years. First, Lemuel Milk, later his daughter, and I can't think of her first name. Jenny Conrad. Okay, so McRae bought his first registered Herefords in 1905 from Mr. Van Natta, and he wrote about it, or actually it is written about in one of the articles about it. He talks about how he came up originally with the idea of doing grade cows. So he just got some cows, found out there was no money in it, and at that point made the decision that he was going to go with hybrid cows. So he got his start in 1905 from Van Natta. I think he bought 3 cows and a bull. And interestingly, I found out from that relation, Van Natta also had a bull that was famous across the face of the whole earth, just like Perfection Fairfax, who we'll see here in a little bit. Anyone know the name of Van Natta's famous bull? It was named Fowler, which I thought was really interesting. And so we'll see, well, actually, I don't know if I have this slide here, but Fowler was in the pedigree of many, many, many of the hybrid cattle that Van Natta sold. So this is the announcement for the very first Orchard Lake sale, which was in 1909. This is the pedigree chart for the most famous bull that ever lived there. And here I really wish I had my pointer, because if we go back here, so here is parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, Earl of Shadeland. That is, the great-great-grandfather, Perfection Fairfax, was one of Adams Earl's bulls that came out of Tippecanoe County from Shadeland, which I thought was really interesting. And they also had a habit of naming their bulls the same and just adding a number on the end. So this was Earl of Shadeland, number 47, 41, okay? And in this picture I'm going to show you next, we see his herdman, his herdman standing there with Earl of Shadeland, number 22. So apparently each new bull just got the same name, but got a number added onto the end of it. This man is said to be the most famous Hereford herdsman in all of the world. At the time he was operating, he was Adams Earl's herdsman, and it tells you a little bit about him. His name was John Lewis. So that's the end of that part. I want to talk now about these bigger-than-life owners of the place. Warren McRae, Daniel F. Rice, who bought it from McRae's widow after he died. Eli Lilly and Company owned the piece for exactly 4 months. No idea why they bought it, but they bought that whole 240. They bought it in the spring of 1951, and in the summer of 1951, they sold it to somebody I'll bet people in here know, Joe Benner. Joe and Henrietta Benner lived there. They owned the farm, and they bought it from Eli Lilly in the fall of 1951. After that, Richard Gumbs bought it on a contract for them in 1972, And in 1986, the present owner, Henry Cousins, picked it up from Richard Gubbs. So Warren McRae lived from 1865 to 1938. He purchased that land for $55 an acre. In the old days, the price of the land is with that, but as you're going to hear later on when we get to some of the later ones, is that surely people here own land and know how it's put into the thing. It's either $1 or $10 and other valuable consideration. You'd ever find out from looking at the deed exactly what people paid, but in the old days, they always put the price on there. So this was his campaign, and I think that there's cards here that have that same picture on it. This was the newspaper account of his victory. The Newton County Enterprise talked about it. And now is the skeleton part. So here are some things that I found about him. The obvious one, of course, was that he was convicted. And he was convicted of lots of different things. I didn't realize until doing the research for this project, he was not convicted of state crimes. That is, there was a trial and it was a hung jury. But before he was able to catch his breath, there was a federal charges filed against him, and he was found guilty on every single one of those counts. Interestingly to me, however, was that before he was elected, there was a newspaper in Jasper County called the Jasper County Democrat, and Jasper County has digitized all of their old newspapers. It was done by the library. They got a grant. And it is the most wonderful thing that has ever happened on the face of the earth, because I can go back. And so what there is there's a whole series of articles during the 1920 presidential campaign where the Jasper County Democrat dragged out all this dirt about McRae. Okay? So I'm not going to cover them in detail, but I'm going to give you the headlines, one of which was that I don't remember any specifics, but I can sort of kind of tell you something. Let's say he had 500 show cattle there, but only reported $45 worth of feed, okay? Or there was another case where he had, then as the election came closer, his assessments kept rising because he realized it was going to be a political problem because these guys were chasing him. So they actually followed up with each of these increased assessments each year in 1917, 1918, 1919, and even in 1919, basically what he was doing was he was counting all of his cattle, all these cattle that were making him $250,000 a year at the sales as grade cattle and valuating them at like $5 a piece. And so this was a hot button issue for him because once it got spread across the state from there, it was like, is Warren McRae a cheat on his taxes? And the answer seems to be yes, because the paper invited people, said, we're not making this up. We went to the courthouse and got all this, and right there, and they have lists and lists and lists that'll make your eyes glaze over of exactly what he reported as his inventory and exactly how he valued it. And at the time that he was kind of at his peak in 1916, he reported a grand total of $150 worth of implements and machinery on his farm. Okay? So that might have been a little bit of an issue. Was he really a farmer? And it turns out, and I don't have time to get into this, and again there, all you got to do is pick up this thing and click on that link and you can read about it. Had he been considered a farmer, he wouldn't have lost his farm because of all the issues that there were during that time of American history. There were special exceptions then, just like there are now for farmers who got into financial trouble that helped farmers try to keep their farms. But when he got into his financial difficulties, he was adjudged not to be a farmer. And this was one of the things that the Jasper County Democrat, over and over, they had these articles that said, he's not a farmer, folks. He wouldn't know which end of the horse to hitch up to his plow. And that's probably pretty much true. At the same token, I know other people who feed a lot of cattle, and I would not say they're not farmers. I mean, they're not farmers in the sense of going out and putting a plow into the ground, but I do think that they're farmers, and I do think he kind of got a raw deal in that respect. How many of you here know about the Rob grain scandal of 1920? Mr. Kelly, who was running the elevator at Rob, took off for a meeting in Indianapolis of grain elevator managers on a Tuesday afternoon. And when he hadn't come back yet on Friday, the office manager basically called the people who were running the elevator and said, "Mr. Kelly appears to be gone." So what did they do the first thing? They're not dumb. It was owned by farmers. They call in an accountant and found out that he was missing $70,000. And it turns out that as the scandal unfolded, a couple of interesting things. The receiver for the elevator was Josiah Porteous, the guy who built the house where I live right now. And through that, I've read all the legal stuff. It turns out that that $70,000 that they lost was done trading with a company called the Sawyer Grain Company. Vice President of Sawyer Grain, Warren T. McRae. So he was involved in that, and they got on him about that. There was a case where the whole bunch of newspapers carried these endorsements that were signed by all these Newton County people and all these Kentland people. McRae is our man, and it got published widely across the whole Midwest, and then by the Jasper County Democrat, got exposed as being fake. They found all these people who said, "I didn't sign that, I have no idea." And the suspicion was that it was the McRae people that faked it, put it up as an ad because he was kind of desperate to get elected at that point. Just one second here. I managed to click off of my slides. There we go. Okay, so he did take on the Klan, and there is quite a bit written about that. It turns out that the people who tried to bribe him when he was governor later were called into court over that attempt to bribe him because he had reported it at the time, and I can't remember the name of the governor. It wasn't the one who succeeded him, who was the lieutenant governor. It was the next elected governor in 1924, and he was a member of the Klan, and he all but admitted he was guilty. And I actually have a separate case I know of where this happened. And then he looks at the judge and says, "Statute of limitations ended 6 months ago. You can't touch me." And that's exactly how it wound up. He was done for. He was guilty as could be and basically flaunting it, but they couldn't do anything about it because they waited too long to prosecute. He was always in serious debt. When we get to this next transaction here, I'll explain some of that to you. If you'd like to read about his time, I found this blog post. Someone who was kind of obsessed with McRae went through all these old newspapers and all these old legal records and things and put together a blog post where he talks about exactly how things fell apart for him. And if you click on that link right there, it takes you there to that description. I'm not going to go on from there. Oh, back here. This is just a little something I wanted to show you. In these pictures I got from Friedline's grandson, it included this picture of the Aid elevator, which was part of the McRae thing. Also, in two of the different pieces that I have, it mentions that he had an elevator in Effner. And when I went over to Watseka Friday, I stopped and I thought, well, that's it right there. So that was McRae's elevator, and it was built by Fred Friedline. And so I was really excited about that. Anybody know the story of the depot that sat next to that elevator? It came from Kentland, and I drove by there in 2018 when I bought Sunnycrest, and I said to myself, what a wonderful thing to see. Here is that old Art Deco depot, and the next time I drove by there, it was a pile of concrete on the ground. And I didn't bring the picture to show you all, but it remains there to this day. And so I'm hoping the farmer that owns it isn't sitting out here right now, because there's nothing. I mean, why would you tear it down and then leave a pile of junk where it was? Because it looks worse now than it did before they tore it down. One of the mysteries of modern farm logic. So then, Warren McRae dies in December of 1938. Warren McRae, one of the richest men in the state of Indiana, had no will. And so his estate went into, it took over a year to get his estate settled, and it was finally purchased by a man named Daniel Rice. And I saw that when I was at the courthouse, and it never struck me to go into Google and type Daniel F. Rice and see what I found. Turns out he was one of the most famous grain traders in Chicago, wound up as a philanthropist. And if you do a Google search for Daniel F. Rice, you will see, here's a building they donated at the University of Illinois, here's the Chicago Botanical Gardens, and here's this and here's that, and 2 or 3 of the nature preserves in Cook County, I think, or Ford County, Illinois, were former properties of his. And so he bought it for $33 an acre. And that is the entire 1,801 acres of it, what could possibly explain, because land was trading much higher than 50 or whatever this was, 33 bucks an acre back then. Well, he assumed $100,000 worth of mortgages. Every piece, it was like solving a differential equation to figure out which bank had which mortgage on which piece of property, and there was a whole extra piece on the deed that had to say this mortgage goes with this one and this one and this one, this mortgage goes with that one and that one. And so Rice took over all those mortgages and paid all those mortgages, but he only had to pay 33 bucks an acre for the farm. So the Rices were pretty busy. He was at one time Chicago's largest grain trader. He was a farmer. He had farms at Wheaton, Illinois, and after he got into this next mentioned business, he bought a big farm in Lexington, Kentucky. You probably know what this next business is going to be if he bought a farm in Lexington, right? He was a horse farmer, and it turns out he owned the winner of the 1965 Kentucky Derby. It was a horse called Lucky Debonair, and he and his wife are in this next picture I'm going to show you. Their home, called Donata, is now a museum and event center in Wheaton, Illinois. Part of their farm is now a nature preserve outside of Wheaton, Illinois. And if you do a web search on his name, it just boggles your mind. There's probably 40 different places that have their name on it from donations that they made. You also, if you want to do the kind of research I was doing, find out that just like Moses Fowler's estate was tied up for years and years and years with lawsuits, Daniel Rice had a lot of money. And so 10 years after he died, they were still fighting over it. Daniel Jr. fought the foundation. He fought the widow. He fought his sisters, fought his cousins. It was an incredible story. I don't know how it wound up. At 10 years out, they hadn't settled his estate yet. But there they are with the horse after it won the Kentucky Derby, which I thought so. He owned Orchard Lake from 1938 until he sold it then to Eli Lilly in 1951. So Richard Gump. So we're not going to talk about Lilly because I don't know anything about it. They bought it in July and sold it in August, or June and August. There's no mention of what they would have done with it, but they did sell it to a man named Joe Benner. And Joe Benner has the interesting triple play for me. His brother Matt and his brother Otto married my grandmother's two first cousins, Anna and Cecilia Klein, and his sister Bernadine married Jimmy Ayler, who was the father of Kenny Ayler from Rensselaer, and Dr. Ayler, the dentist, and all of that. They were all from Benton County because the Aylers started out actually in between Robb and Earl Park. And the newspaper accounts would show some very interesting things happened to the Ayler family when they lived there, and I'm going to leave it at that. Okay? So he bought it in 1972, and he paid $666.66 an acre for it. And again, when he bought, I think, it was 1,801 acres, but of all that, only 240 acres of that ever was really part of Orchard Lake, which was the weird thing. So Fred Gumbs' legacy, those of you who grew up where I grew up would know this. He had 5 sons, and every one of his 5 sons became a large, and by large I mean multiple thousands of acres back in the 30s and 40s of muck farmers. Okay? Henry told me he farms a little muck. Is there anybody else in here that farms muck? Because muck farming is a completely different deal than farming mineral soils. And if you've ever tried to farm, Henry did not seem fond of muck soils, okay? But the Gumbs brothers all farmed muck. Every single one of their farms was on muck. Victor, the oldest one, farmed in Pulaski County. And I don't think I'm telling any tales out of school. Victor didn't live very long because he was a drinker. And so he died at age 48, and his nephew, who I consulted as part of this, told me, said, once Uncle Art saw what happened to Uncle Victor, Uncle Art quit drinking. Okay, and we have a picture of Art sitting in a bar with his brothers coming up here, and Art has a Coke, whereas the rest of them all are drinking beer. Anyway, so Victor was in Pulaski County. Richard was the most successful, and if I started telling you where he farmed, I could talk for the rest of the night and I wouldn't probably finish. He had farms in Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, and in, I think, 12 counties in Indiana. And to give you an idea, between 1945 and 1985, there were 65 farm property transactions just for him in that period of time. He bought and sold land like a madman. Elmer was the third boy. He bought a farm along the Kankakee River in South Bend. He had 3,200 acres up there. Arthur was in Jasper and Pulaski County, and when I grew up, Arthur's farm was right next to the farm that I worked on. And for those of you who are farmers here, Arthur's farm was always distinguished by an unusual thing. They'd have the combine in the field over in this side in early May and the planter on that side. He'd bring the combine and the planter, and he would harvest the same day that he planted the next year's crops. He didn't last very long either, okay? Marcus was the most colorful gums boy, and I have to tell you that if you want to do a quick Google on him, he was an anti-government activist. He had a 3,200-acre farm in Baraboo, Wisconsin. To stick his finger in the eyes of the Wisconsin people, he had a festival every year on his farm that was called Weedstock, okay? He in and out of court constantly. He ran for public office, I think, 54 times in his lifetime altogether. And if you just Google his name, you'll find out everybody in Wisconsin knew who Marcus Gums was. Now about Richard himself, and once I get the phone unsleeped, his descendants are still farming today, and I just heard a great story on that. I talked to so Richard Gums' grandson's name is Richard as well, and he farms Marcus's farm in Wisconsin. And what he said, I said, so how did you wind up with Marcus's farm? And he said, Marcus was the most bullheaded man ever walked the earth. He got into it with somebody who had a mortgage on his farm, and they wanted to collect. He didn't think he owed them the money. He refused to pay them. They went into foreclosure. He refused to show up at the foreclosure hearings. And he said, so my brother and I drove up to Baraboo, and we stood there at the courthouse, and we bought his farm at the auction from the sheriff. And I said, so how did Marcus react to that? And he said, well, he about but he had nothing by that time. Apparently in Wisconsin, you can't redeem it. So they have it. So now Richard's two grandsons farm Marcus's land, which is up in Baraboo, Wisconsin. So Richard's vast enterprise included this, the 50-plus transactions in Newton County alone. He grew mint potatoes up around Enos, and some of you probably know that. He had a packing house in Morocco. And so he had, eventually they farmed out little parcels growing potatoes. That was one of his two things. Potatoes was one, mint was the other. And according to several pieces that I saw, he introduced mint farming in Newton County in 1963, first up by Enos, but then even later further south, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. At one time, he and his brother Elmer were partners before Elmer bought his farm at South Bend, and they were considered to be the largest mint growers in the whole United States. They had about 5,000 acres of peppermint that they grew back in the 40s. His whole deal began on a farm that the family calls the Burbank Farm. And when I was about 30 years old, this old man next to me at a restaurant said, you know where that farm got its name? They bought it from Luther Burbank, the famous researcher. And I have been unable to verify that fact. None of the Gums people, when I ask them why do they call it the Burbank Farm, answer is uniquely the same across all of them. I don't know. So there is a mystery to be looked into, and I don't know whether this guy who told me this had anything on the ball or not. He bought Orchard Lake in 1972. He worked locally with Marvin Miller, and he also, when he bought the farm, for those of you who may know this, Butch Derflinger moved into the house at Orchard Lake when he bought the farm, and when he sold it then later, actually Butch moved out just a couple years prior. He told me he was there from 72 to 83, something along those lines. He didn't know who lived there afterwards, but then Henry didn't get it until 1986. So this is a picture of Richard and Arthur back on their father's farm. Their sister is in between there. She became a famous artist. And only for reasons of not wanting to clog up my slides, she has a beautiful painting that she did of their homestead, which was in Pulaski County. But on the left is Richard as a young man. And part of the reason I included this was he started out farming with horses in Denham, Indiana, and wound up then as one of the most progressive farmers in the state. This is his brother Victor, and the reason that I included this picture was not because of Victor, because of his feet. Can you imagine how long it took him to put on his boots every morning? And here's the thing. I grew up on a muck farm, Bill Gering's muck farm, and if I had a picture of Bill Gering, if I had a picture of Richard Gumbs, if I had a picture of Marcus Gumbs, they're all wearing those same boots. Now the question, why? It's because muck will itch you to the point where you'll scratch it and wish you were dead instead of, I'm not kidding you. Growing up on those muck farms, I would scratch my legs at night till they bled. It was so bad. Mr. Gering, Mr. Gumbs, they couldn't afford that kind of behavior, so they came out all cinched up where the muck couldn't get at them whatsoever, but I can only imagine how long it took them to put on their shoes in the morning. So this was an interesting picture that Steve Gumbs sent me. Richard's in the back left. Elmer is at the front left. Back there is Arthur. The other person here might only mean something to somebody from Pulaski County. His name is Fred Vorm. Anybody recognize the name? Because he got rich doing something that I find hard to believe. He owned the American Oak Preserving Company, and what they did was that they gathered oak leaves in the savannas around North Judson and sold them to florists. And he became a millionaire doing that. And when I was a kid, his factory still stood in North Judson, and he had a big farm where he grew mint. He actually didn't do it himself, but this meeting was in Chicago. They were meeting with the Secretary of Agriculture and the Secretary of Commerce. It was during World War II. Mexico was neutral in that war, and you probably know that we grew marijuana around here because they didn't have a source for making rope. Well, what they were doing in this meeting was that someone had proposed that they were having trouble getting oil because so many of the oil-producing countries that we depended upon were neutral in the war as well, and they were looking into the possibility of lubricating with mint oil. Wouldn't that have been an interesting thing? It didn't pan out, but Steve told me that's what this picture is, kind of a family totem. This was when they were thinking about using mint oil as a lubricant. This is a picture of the Gumbs family right at the end of their lives. Fred is in the front. His wife Hulda is next to him. The artist, whose name I now cannot, Helene, and then going around the edge is Elmer, Richard, Marcus. No, Richard's over here on the right, so that has to be Art back there, and Victor was dead by then. He died in 1949. So Henry bought the farm in 1986. He purchased it in 1986 for $10 and other considerations. And so I actually, pardon? That's what they put on the deeds now, for $10 and other valuable consideration. So some of the highlights of Henry being there, he came from Granger and Mishawaka, and as part of this, I've had a wonderful reunion. It turns out that his family and his brother's family were sort of mentors to one of my former students who now lives in Idaho. And when I put up a little picture on my Facebook page, this kid, well, now he's 50 years old, but he was a kid when I knew him. He said, "Oh, I know the Cousins," and he said his brother Frank was absolutely one of the most important people in my life. So that was a kind of a cool thing that I got back in touch with somebody through my research for this project. He purchased Orchard Lake in 1986, but again, you have to know, Henry purchased over 2,000 acres. Only that little 240 was part of the same Orchard Lake that got sold back in 1939. There were few buildings left at that point. The pavilion was still there, and we have the people here now. A chiropractor from Lafayette, I'm sure you all know this story, made a deal with Henry. He bought the barn for $1. They took it apart. They moved it over 22 miles to where, now I've got to remember how you pronounce it, Wheeling? Wheeling, yes. I know Whalings and I know Wheelings, and I had a little trouble trying to remember what their name was. In any event, Henry also commissioned a statue of perfection, Fairfax, which all of you I'm sure know as well, but that is kind of a notable thing that came as part of Henry's tenure there. Whoops. This is a picture of the pavilion today, and it's not too far from the 231 exit off of I-65. Okay, a mile and a half off of I-65, and so they have been doing a wonderful job with it as an event center. And now I have some pictures that I took while I was visiting. So this is Orchard Lake last week. So there's still a lake there. Unfortunately, The lake had much more extent in the past, but because it's not spring-fed, it eventually filled in, and it has been cleaned up and dredged out and made back into a lake. It was more like Orchard Marsh, I think, when Henry took it over in 1986. There's the famous statue, which sits right in front of his house, which most of you probably know. If you go to South Newton High School, you really can't miss it. This is the castellated silo on the north part of the property, and here's a picture from 1915 that shows that silo surrounded by cattle, and that's all the way at the north end. Okay? This is the monument and the grave of Perfection Fairfax, the famous bull who died in 1920. There's a flagpole on the top of that, and remember, I was taking all this in the wind, and I had sand in my eyes, and after I wanted to get the flagpole in it too, and after about 4 tries, I gave up. This is the only remaining building that's on the property that was there back then. This was the pump and generator house, which sits just to the south side of Orchard Lake and has now been covered for preservation purposes, but this is the only building there today which was there when McRae had it. This is the mint still, which I thought was pretty interesting. It doesn't sit right on the same farm, but it's about a mile or so away from it. And it was, Henry actually grew mint for a while after he got here, but was following up on the mint industry that was already here from Richard Gums's time. So that's it. I wanted to thank the people who helped me with this, of which there were many. Richard Gums, the grandson, Steve Gums, whose father was Elmer at South Bend. He's the one who sent me the pictures. Henry gave me a mountain of material. I've interviewed Butch Derflinger a couple of times, and Beth gave me 100 different views and different things that I've extracted to do this presentation. Well, I really appreciate your attention, everybody. I am honored always to speak to you all, and I hope it was worth your time.